Good morning, and welcome to All Things Marcellus with me, Attorney Doug Clark of the Clark Law Firm. I am located at 1563 Main Street in Peckville, and I'm here every Sunday from 8 to 9 on these stations to provide landowners valuable information that you need regarding the natural gas development here in Pennsylvania. And as I say all the time, if you are a landowner, then this is the radio show for you. This is done to educate and be informative to landowners in the area and across the entire state. But this is the landowner show. There's no slants here. I don't represent companies, never have, never will, and represent landowners and only landowners. So, I'm going to tell you right now, I'm really excited about today's show because I'm going to do something a little bit different. I'm going to talk about pipeline agreements, but I'm going to explain why you as a landowner, when you're given a pipeline right-of-way agreement offer, why the first thing you need to do is take several step backs. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to talk about two specific agreements, real agreements that are being handed to Pennsylvania landowners across northeastern Pennsylvania at the present time. And I'm going to explain, I'm going to go through the terms verbatim, word by word, and I'm going to explain what they say, what they mean, and what the problems are. And I am confident, complete confidence that when you hear this, if you're listening and you hear this, you're going to understand, wow, I'm glad I heard this. I'm glad I understand. And whatever you decide to do with that information is your decision, as I say all the time, but you are going to be happy that you've heard this and you're going to have a better understanding of what the problems are. Because, I say it all the time, who's going to tell you about the problems? The company landman? Are they going to tell you about the problems? I'll answer that question. No, they're not. Okay, so it's important that you understand what these issues are. So jumping back to my intro script, but I implore you, stay tuned here today because I'm excited about it. I've been preparing for this, looking at these terms, reading these documents again and again and again, and there's some things which I think that you're going to find very interesting. Okay, with that said, again, I am Doug Clark. This is All Things Marcellus. Been doing this radio show weekly for over 4 years now, and if you want to get some information, want to check out some of these other shows, done many pipeline shows, gas lease shows, all types of shows, royalty shows, you name it. I think I've done a show on it. There's well over 150 plus hours of radio shows available online. Go check them out at pagasleaseattorney.com, pipelineattorney.com. Again, I'm going to talk a lot about pipelines today. Have a website, pipelineattorney.com, dedicated to pipeline issues. And again, you don't have to hire me. This isn't some big commercial. This is about making sure that you understand what these issues are and to get you thinking. And, if you want to hire me and you're considering a pipeline, hey, we're here. Love to help you out. But if you don't hire me, hire somebody else. But do something about this because landowners are being taken advantage of every single day. And I believe, part of my obligation is to make sure that we're getting good information out there. And the key is have your good information, make the right decision for you. Regular listeners know maybe I sound like a broken record on these points and they say, geez, here is another rerun. It's not another rerun. Okay, what it is it's just the truth. And I see it all the time. I deal with it every week. I deal with it almost every day. And we need to make sure that we're thinking about these issues. So again, I am Doug Clark. I represent landowners, only landowners, gas lease negotiations, pipeline, waterline agreements. Over, I think, 50 companies now have negotiated pipeline right-of-way agreements in Pennsylvania. Royalty issues, going to give you guys a break again on royalty issues, but check out pagasleaseattorney.com. If you're not informed on the royalty deduction issue, you need to be. And if you want to have a free evaluation, whether I believe that the company is taking improper deductions, as far as are they allowed to take deductions, and my opinion is they're not permitted, but they are, you can send me your information and contact the office, 570-307-0702. Send me your information, and I'll give you a written opinion, no obligation, completely confidential. You need to be informed. Look online. You got to get informed on this issue. Check out pagasleaseattorney.com. Check out other sources. You really need to be informed. And of course, if you do need representation, this isn't a big commercial, but you can always contact me, 570-307-0702. 0702. Check out our testimonials on the websites. That's a representation is an individual decision. Maybe we're not, maybe I'm not the right person for you. That's your decision. But if you're looking for representation, you want to learn more, you can contact us at 570-307-0702. And again, I say this often, don't be afraid of distance. Had clients in India, London, currently in Texas, Micronesia, again, Pacific Islands. So, distance is very rarely ever an issue. So, don't be deterred by the fact that maybe you're in Western Pennsylvania. I have many active Western Pennsylvania clients at the present time. Okay, so jumping now to the issue. What I'm going to do, I am going to talk about two specific general pipeline agreements that are being proposed to landowners in northeastern Pennsylvania. One agreement is the agreement being proposed by what we typically call Williams or Williams Field Services. And the other one is and Williams does a lot of the work in Susquehanna County, a lot in Wyoming. We're going to see them doing more in Bradford. So they're one of the biggest companies. I deal with Williams almost every day, certainly every week, but almost every day. Several active files with them, and probably easily done over 100 agreements with them in the past. So I want to talk about their agreement, and I also want to talk about Appalachian Midstream Services, or AMS. Now, that's a company who's very active in Bradford County that does the work as far as the pipeline agreements for Chesapeake in most cases. So you may also access Midstream as another company that does work for Chesapeake. But we're going to talk about these two agreements, the Appalachian Midstream Services, also known as AMS, and also the Williams agreements. And what happens? What do I mean by this? Okay, many people know this. Some people haven't had the experience, and maybe you'll have the experience very soon. Knock on the door, you're contacted, a landman comes up and says, hey, we want to have a pipeline right away on your property. And what do? They bring with them this pipeline agreement. Now, these agreements, typically what every company does, like I said, I've dealt with about 50 different companies. They all have their, what I call their form agreement. Their first 2, 3, 4 pages, sometimes 1 page. What it'll say essentially is, hey, here's the basic right-of-way agreement between you, the landowner, and the company. Now, in every one of these cases, you need to add additional terms. Now, we're not going to get into the addendum and additional terms now, but what I'm going to talk to you about is these form agreements and what you need to watch out for. So the company guy comes out, knocks on the door. Landman comes out, knocks on your door. And as I say, these guys are generally nice. They don't get people to sign by coming out and being mean to you. They come knock on the door, nice guys, tell you their history and how they're pro landowner and all those things. And some of these guys, hey, are nice guys. They have jobs to do, but you need to understand what we're dealing with. So come out, they hand you this agreement, and they'd love for you to sign on that specific day, that first day. But again, your first step as a smart landowner is going to be backwards. Your second step as even a smarter landowner is going to be another step backwards. Okay, we want to step back. We don't want to agree to anything. We don't want to talk about money. Okay, we want to listen, and then we want to take this paperwork and we want to get some assistance. And we want to find out, is this something you even want to consider? I do probably as many pipeline agreements, and I can't say with certainty, but I would think that there's probably unlikely that there's anyone in the state doing more landowner representation of pipeline agreements than what we're doing. I could be wrong, but I think that's probably a fair statement. If not, let's say there's not very many doing more. So one of the first questions I'll say to people as a first-time client, first-time meeting or having our conference, telephone conference is, if you can say no, why do you want to do this? And let's talk about that. And there's been many times where I've talked my client landowner out of entering into a pipeline agreement and said, look, I just don't think this is for you. And this is losing a client, but it's what's best for you. And you need to understand that maybe you can say no and you don't want to do this. So that's step one. And I've talked about that before in the show, but I'm not gonna go too deep on that right now. What I want to do is I want to talk about what is in these agreements. Literally, what are the words in these agreements, these form agreements that you, the landowner, presented with? What are the terms? And what should we be concerned about? So I'm gonna jump around a bit, but I'm gonna focus on I'm gonna probably focus mostly on this Appalachian Midstream contract, the AMS contract, which again is usually done with the Chesapeake midstream operations, meaning connecting Chesapeake's well, very common in Bradford County and also Susquehanna County. But I'm also going to talk a lot about the Williams agreement. So we'll do some jumping around, and I'll make sure I identify which one. So if you have an offer and you're sitting there and it's handy, or on a commercial break, go grab it, and you can follow along. This is to educate you on what you should be thinking about and what you should be concerned about. Okay, so you're handed a document, and if you're handed the Appalachian Midstream document, it's typically going to be called a pipeline right-of-way agreement. Now, one thing I wish that they would identify it as a pipeline right-of-way option agreement, because that's what they are. And that's saying that the company, even though you sign this, doesn't mean that it's going to go ahead and move forward and continue and develop under this agreement and go ahead and install a pipeline. The company has the option. It's their choice on whether they're going to go ahead and move forward. Now, the Williams document is actually called an option. It's called Option to Purchase Pipeline Easement. Better title, because it is truly an option. So, okay, back to the AMS document. Very, very common document. So I'm going to paraphrase and I'm going to quote some too. So at the beginning it talks about it's going to name the parties, who's the landowner, who's the company, is Appalachian Midstream. So it says, for in consideration of the sum of $100. So $100 is what they're going to give you when you sign this document. Now, it's not immediately, but within, say, 30 days of time you sign it. But they're going to give you only $100. That's it. Now, you can negotiate potentially to get higher money up front. And very often with these companies, because we do so many agreements with them, we've been able to negotiate a much higher figure up front in order to make sure that we at least offset any attorney fees. Because what happens, they're going to pay you $100. So you hire me to work with you, and you get a bill. I'm going to tell you, your bill is going to be more than $100. And if the company doesn't all end up exercising this agreement or installing these pipelines, well, how much sense does that make? You've just paid an attorney, you've got $100, and now you're out this money, and you're looking at yourself saying, why in the world did I ever do that? And again, that's something that needs to be discussed. It needs to be discussed with your attorney. And why would you do it? Why would you spend money on an attorney when you don't know if you're ever going to recoup that money? Now, there's times where you will do that, because the problem is I don't want to sign this agreement because it's so bad, and I'm willing to pay some money for my attorney to negotiate this and to change it because it's too bad of an agreement. And if they do ultimately enter into the agreement, if they do exercise the option and go ahead and move forward, then it's going to result in a substantial amount of money. So there are times that you may want to do that, but you need to be thinking about that, and we need to be talking about that. So, all right, what I'm going to do, I'm going to go into this break, because when we get back, I'm going to tell you about the grant. So, okay, for the AMS agreement, the company is saying we're going to give you $100, and what are we going to get? So what we're going to talk about after the break is the granting clause. What you as the landowner are granting the company or giving the company. And I'll also say, coming into this, that the Williams option to purchase pipeline agreement also says, for in consideration of the sum of $100 initial payment. So in exchange for that $100 that you're getting, what are you giving the company? We're going to talk about that when we get back. I am attorney Doug Clark of the Clark Law Firm. You are listening to All Things Marcellus. I'm here every Sunday from 8 to 9, and I'll be right back after this break. Welcome back to All Things Marcellus with me, attorney Doug Clark. Again, I'm here every Sunday from 8 to 9 a.m., and I'm going to jump into this, but there's going to be a lot of information, and it's going to be tight for me to fit this in. So really encourage you. You can go back, check us out on iTunes. We'll have the show available there, because there's a lot of great information. So again, get out your agreement. Check it out. Think about these things. Listen to this again, because there's a lot of information to digest. I want you to be educated and informed and think about these things. And whatever you do from there, that's your call. So, okay, talking about the AMS, Appalachian Midstream Services General Foreign Pipeline Agreement, as well as the Williams General Foreign Pipeline Agreement. Now, I don't have enough time to go through every single provision here today, but I'm going to focus on several of these provisions which you, as the landowner, need to be focusing on. And your attorney needs to be focusing on as well. Okay, so we said how this works is it's an option. The company says, I'm going to pay you $100 up front. $100, that's it. $100 up front. In exchange, you're granting the following. So we call this the granting clause. Now I'm going to read this verbatim. This is the AMS granting clause in this easement. Okay, so paragraph number 1, easement. A permanent and exclusive easement and right-of-way. So remember, permanent and exclusive, meaning others, you can't give this area to others. 65 feet in width. So permanent easement, 65 feet wide. Together with all improvements located on, in, over, under, through, and across grantor, and I'm going to substitute in here landowner for grantor so it's easier to understand, across landowner's land for the purpose of locating, constructing, maintaining, operating, relocating, replacing, or altering the size of without interruption of service and removing or abandoning one or more pipelines for the transportation of gas, now pay attention, or fluids, whether hydrocarbon or non-hydrocarbon, including water used in or resulting from oil and gas well drilling and production operations, gas or fluids produced or derived from wells, lands or formations not owned or controlled by landowner, and, important, and appurtenant above ground facilities. I'm going to pause for a second. So that means things that are above ground. This isn't just a pipeline underground. So a couple highlights here. I'm going to stop for a second. Couple highlights. They can replace the pipeline. They can relocate it. They can change the size. They can abandon. It can be one or more pipelines for the transportation of gas. Well, that's what you're assuming, but also fluids, including fluids resulting from oil and gas well drilling and fluids produced or derived from wells. So think about that. So, okay, and above ground facilities. Remember that. Above ground facilities. Items above ground that you're going to see. Potentially substantial. I want to highlight 65 feet permanent area. 65 feet wide. Pretty big area. Again, if you're comfortable with that, hey, that's great. But you have to understand that. You have to understand what is 65 feet. So going on, this is still, in exchange for this $100 that you're getting now, there's a potential for future payment, and there would be future payment if the company uses these rights. But for now, for this $100, you're also then giving them the right to above ground facilities. I'm going to continue on quoting here, including temporary surface water lines. So water lines above the ground in this area for drilling, completion, testing, and production operations, and appurtenant above ground facilities, including cathodic protection, fluid removal equipment, data acquisition facilities, using methods and techniques not restricted to current technology to perform necessary pre-construction work. Pay attention here. Pay close attention to install electrical power and communication service, and we get a lot of these ands, notice, and to have reasonable off easement. So outside of this area that they're this 65-foot area, and to have reasonable off easement ingress and egress, meaning travel to and from its facilities across and through lands which are owned by grantor or landowner across your lands. So that is substantial. Say, hey, here, knock on the door. Yeah, we'd like to install a pipeline. We want you to sign this document. It's an easement agreement. Well, what are you actually granting them? Well, with the AMS agreement, what I just read. Now, I'm going to jump to the Williams agreement. Now, we're focusing on AMS and Williams, two of the biggest companies as far as purchasing the most right-of-way areas in Susquehanna, Wyoming, Bradford counties. Although I'm talking about AMS and Williams, all these form agreements have this standard grant language. Now, they're not all the same. So I just read you AMS's grant language and highlighted some of the concerns. And obviously, I have a lot, and I would think that you would also have a lot as the landowner when you really look at this. But remember, we're talking about AMS, we're talking about Williams, but all right-of-ways have these granting clause, which is, to me, the most important foundation of this agreement, which we now need to make sure that we're trying to address when we're negotiating additional terms and addendum. So, okay, here is the Williams. This is the Williams easement agreement language as far as what the granting clause. So remember, they're going to give you $100. That's the option payment. So they may or may not exercise the option in the future, and I'm going to talk about that more later. But what are they saying here? So they're giving you this $100. The landowner, again, I'm going to use landowner instead of grantor, does hereby grant, warrant, and convey and assign to the company. I'm going to say company instead of grantee. So we'll say Williams. And its successors and assigns an exclusive easement and right-of-way for the purpose at any time and from time to time of surveying, clearing, removing obstructions, laying, excavating, installing, constructing, maintaining, inspecting, operating, altering, repairing, testing, replacing, relaying, relocating, changing the size of, and remove and or abandoning in place one or more pipelines and appurtenances. Again, appurtenances are these, valve sites, these anything above ground, what's associated with these pipelines. So, I notice as I'm reading this, how many of these words ending in ing? Surveying, clearing, removing, obstructions, laying, excavating, installing, constructing, maintaining, inspecting, operating, altering, repairing, testing, replacing, relaying, relocating, changing. All of these things. Now, let's focus on some of the highlights here from this sentence. So all of these rights that you're granting here, potentially that they may exercise. So changing the size of and removing and or replacing or abandoning in place one or more pipelines and appurtenances. So remember, it's not just one appurtenance, it's one or more pipelines and appurtenances. Goes on to say, and erecting, maintaining, remember, erecting, maintaining, and removing all related above and below ground appurtenances necessary or convenient. Anytime you see that convenient, that always makes me nervous because now you're giving the company a lot of discretion. What do they find convenient? So, again, they can maintaining and removing all related above and below ground appurtenances, above ground and below appurtenances, necessary or convenient for Williams operations, including but not limited to, drips, valves, fittings, markers, meters, cathodic protection, and all other equipment and appurtenances as may be necessary or convenient for such operations. Okay, so including but not limited to, think about this. I'm going to jump this here. Including but not limited to all other equipment and appurtenances as may be necessary or convenient for the operations, and if necessary, okay, I'm going to continue on, and if necessary to construct, maintain, operate, remove, upgrade, and replace electrical power and or communication and control facilities. And they hereinafter collectively refer to this as, so hereinafter, all of the aforesaid, so all of these rights they just said, may be collectively referred to as, quote, pipelines. Talk about a bit misleading later on. All of those rights are collectively referred to as pipelines. These guys are smart. Remember, I say this all the time. This isn't their first rodeo. These guys are smart. All of these things, above ground appurtenances, the ability to construct, maintain, operate, remove, upgrade, and replace electrical power and communication. Well, from now on in this agreement, we're going to call all of these rights pipelines. Does electrical power sound like pipelines? Communication, pipelines, above ground facilities, pipelines? But that's what they're going to be referred to. So every time you see pipelines, you're thinking, oh, there's going to be a pipeline underground, or a second pipeline, maybe a third. Well, pipelines is defined hereinafter, or it's using all of these rights are defined as pipelines. You need to understand that. You need to understand that when you're reading this agreement. That's your responsibility as the landowner. If you're going to sign an agreement, you need to understand this. Now, you may ultimately just see one pipeline installed, but you may ultimately see many more things, other things happening that you never really thought about. And you're thinking about pipelines, but you're not realizing that pipelines include the ability to install electric power and communication, above ground facilities, all of these different items. Okay, continuing on here, still in the same paragraph. I'm going to be going over in this section. I'm going to go over time in this section of this show here that we're doing, just reading the two granting clause. Just reading these granting clauses, just reading what you're giving the company in exchange for this initial $100. Now, I said before, I do these agreements all the time. I'm not saying we can't reach agreements, but I'm saying why you need to look at these and what you need to understand and why you need to negotiate. If you're going to do this, you need to understand your rights and you need to maximize your position, because these documents give the company so much power. And later on, what they're going to say, if they want to do something, you say, well, I didn't think that. You weren't going to do that. They said, well, you signed the agreement. So you got to know what's in this agreement. Okay, I'm going to finish up here, and we're going to take a break. Okay, still in the granting clause of the Williams pipeline, or option to purchase pipeline easement agreement, it goes on to say, along with ingress and egress thereto, meaning to and from the pipeline area or facilities, for the transportation of oil, gas, petroleum products. All right, hey, maybe that's reasonable. Then it goes on, or any substances which can be transported through pipelines. Any substances which can be transported through pipelines. And then it states, all rights granted herein being collectively referred to as the purpose, quote, purpose. It says on and through and across a strip of 75 feet in width. 75 feet on your property. 75 feet. They can do all of these things within 75 feet. And those gas pipelines, yeah, they can be used to transport gas, but they can also be used for oil or any other substance which can be transported through pipelines. Anything that they can transport through a pipeline, they have the right to do under this agreement. You're listening to All Things Marcellus with me, Attorney Doug Clark, and the Clark Law Firm. We're going to get back. I'm going to talk more about this Williams Pipeline Right-of-Way Agreement, the AMS, Appalachian Midstream Pipeline Right-of-Way Agreement, very common agreements in Susquehanna and Bradford and Wyoming County. We'll be right back, pointing out some other things that you have to know and you have to be thinking about. Be right back after this break. Welcome back to All Things Marcellus with me, Attorney Doug Clark. Again, I'm here every Sunday, from 8 to 9 a.m. on these stations. Been doing this show since August of 2010. I really like this show. I like it. It's an opportunity to, it's almost therapeutic for me at times, just to try to get this information. Again, if you're looking for representation, need assistance, love to see if we can help you out. But whether it's me or somebody else, you need to be clued in on these issues. One of the things that happens with these pipeline agreements, they're often tied to the gas lease. And the landman will say, well, if you don't do this, we can do it under the gas lease. Well, some things they can, sometimes they can't. Also, some things they can't. So when we talk about, you signed a gas lease, an oil and gas lease, does that give them the right to install communication equipment, electrical lines? Well, that depends. Does it give them the right to transport anything they can possibly transport through pipelines? Probably not. So even though there may be this, the company may have the ability to install a pipeline, and I can't stress enough, may not, and many times they don't, but maybe they do. But when you do this, if you enter into this agreement, it's that gas lease doesn't control this agreement. This is a new agreement. So when you sign that agreement, we just read those granting clauses, you're signing those rights. So they're gone. I assure you, they're going far beyond the gas lease rights. Now, sometimes, like I said, I do a ton of these agreements. I've got probably a couple dozen active files with companies across the state. We reach agreements all the time. But the point is this is saying why you need to have these terms addressed. They are oppressive, in my opinion, and they're unnecessary. And almost always you can get these terms changed dramatically. Not always exactly how you want, but dramatically changed. So think about these things. Don't just think, well, I have a pipeline or I have a gas lease, so therefore I have to sign that. Okay, it's not necessarily true. First off, you never have to sign it. The company can put the pipelines in under the lease. It's not always the worst thing, but you need to understand all of these things. And the guy or girl to advise you isn't the company landman. It's not. You need somebody who's experienced to help you. I stress, if it's me, hey, great. But make sure it's somebody. I don't want this to be a commercial for me. I want this to be informational so you're looking at these things. Okay, jumping back to this. So if you miss any of today's show, again, go to pagasleaseattorney.com, pipelineattorney.com. Go check out, we're on YouTube. Type in All Things Marcellus. Get out your agreement and compare it to what we're talking about here. Replay, educate yourself, learn about this. I'm not making things up. This is the documents. Learn about this. Become informed. You need to do this. So what I did was, if you're just joining, we talked about the companies in AMS, very big in Bradford County, Williams, very big in Susquehanna County, both in Wyoming, Williams also in Bradford, and going to be doing more in Bradford. So went through, talked about $100 option payment. Then there's these granting clauses. Very, very detailed, very broad, very expansive. The rights that you're granting to the company. So we talked about, well, there's $100. That's what they're paying you. Well, you're always going to hear things about so much money per foot, so much money per foot. Again, I've done many shows on this. So it's very difficult to explain it all here today and go back and check them out. But let's get into this what we can here. So they're offering you $100. Many times that number is negotiable. Sometimes it isn't. And if it's not, why are you going to sign this agreement and grant all these rights in exchange for $100? I don't know. I don't know why you would do it. Okay, so, well, what happens now? Surely you're not doing all this and they're giving you $100. Well, they give you $100, you grant these rights, and then if they say, yes, we want to go ahead and use this agreement, they're going to pay you a second payment. That'll be the payment for compensation or money to actually have this area of your property to use. And then a second payment, which is it's typically just a one payment, but it's broken down for compensation to use it, but then also for the surface damages, crops, timber, other damages, things of that nature. Well, how long after you sign the agreement do you find out if you're going to get these second payments? So let's address that. Okay, first, let's go ahead and look at, make sure I got the right one here. Okay, first we're going to look at the AMS, or the Bradford County was common in Bradford County, but it's the AMS typical language here. So the payment term in this agreement says, this agreement will remain in full force and effect if company, again, I substitute company instead of grantee. So here AMS either or does either one of the following. So either does one of these two, one of the following within 2 years from the date of the term, so the date of the agreement. So AMS's agreement to you says, we'll give you $100, you give us those rights we talked about, and we have to do one of these two things within a 2-year time frame. So the first item would be pay grantor the sum of $15 per linear foot as a one-time payment for the easements, or for the easement and the rights granted to the company for actual surface damages to the landowner's property, including damages to crops and marketable timber that result from grantee or company's occupation and use of the easement. Okay, so let me take a step back. Number one, within 2 years, they would have to do one of the two following. The first one being pay you $15, which covers everything, compensation and damages, $15 per foot. Now, as a general rule, that is a very low market price. Again, you need to get some assistance when you're figuring out what are you supposed to be asking for, because sometimes, and we have clients that get 50, 60, 100, sometimes hundreds of dollars a foot, but not all the time by any means. We have to understand your circumstances and your leverage. $15 a foot, in my experience, is the lowest amount that any of my clients are signing for. And when they're signing for that type of amount, it's typically because we don't have leverage, and it's because the gas lease would permit a pipeline, but we limit this so it's still following the terms of the gas lease. You're not going beyond. You're not giving them these expansive rights in exchange for $15 a foot. Ladies and gentlemen, please, $15 a foot is the bare low market price in my experience, and only rarely are we going to agree to that, and that's because we're going to not have a lot of any other options. We're going to maximize it, we're going to get in and we're going to get out because you don't have a lot of leverage. But how do you figure that out? You need to get some assistance generally, because a lot of times we have leverage. We have clients, again, hundreds of dollars a foot at times, but not always. That's not a promise here, but you need to understand your leverage. So again, AMS says, how do we even get to this second payment, or how does this agreement go on? Within 2 years, we either pay you this $15 per foot price, or number two, or begins activities for pipeline construction. Begins activities for pipeline constructions. Well, what is that? Begins activities for pipeline construction and subsequently tenders the easement payment to the landowner. So in 2 years, we either give you $15 a foot, or we begin activities for pipeline construction. Again, what does that mean? Does that mean digging? Does that mean clearing? Does that mean permitting? What does that mean? Okay, so the second option, if they don't pay you, they could begin pipeline activities and then subsequently tender payment to you. Well, geez, when's that coming? All right, but then it gets worse, in my opinion. Goes on to state, if the company extends the term, then the company may file a notice of term extension for recording in the county records. Not that big here, because you'd have to agree to extend a term. So that's not a major sentence. This next one is something that gives me a lot of concern, these next couple. If the company has not tendered the easement payment by the end of the initial term, so that 2-year term, if the company hasn't given you that $15 payment, upon receipt of written notice of non-payment from the landowner. So what does this say here so far? Company didn't pay you. It's 2 years. You're sitting there, well, okay, this must be over. They didn't pay me. Well, you have to write them written notice of non-payment. Hey, AMS, hey, Appalachian Midstream, you didn't pay me. It's been 2 years. You now have to write this. Remember, you only got $100 under this agreement. They paid you $100. Now you have an obligation, if they don't do this, to write them and say, hey guys, you haven't paid me. Then the company shall have the right. The company then, after you write them, they have the right, but not the obligation, to tender the easement payment within 60 days. So, let that sink in. They give you $100 under this agreement. 2 years pass, you don't see another dime. You say, okay, this is over. Well, you actually have to write to them and say, hey guys, you didn't pay me. This is over. You didn't pay me. So now, after they get that letter, you're not just writing them, say, hey, this is over. They still get an additional 60 days after they get your letter to decide whether or not to pay you. And then if the company pays this payment, the easement payment, this agreement shall remain in full force and effect. Ladies and gentlemen, that's crazy. In my opinion, that's crazy. You need to change that. You need to change that. They give you $100. You give them all of these rights in a 65-foot area of your property. You give them all of these rights. And then if they don't do anything within 2 years, and again, they're offering you $15 a foot, lowest market price that I see in northeastern Pennsylvania ever at this time. Lowest, absolutely lowest. They say, well, if we don't pay you, you have to write us, and we still have 60 days, 2 months, that we can then pay you and keep this going, or we'll just let it go at that point. Why would you sign this agreement? Why would you do it? Thankfully, I want to say, like I said, we do these agreements. I do these agreements. We have many agreements with this company. But we reach agreements where you're going to see, we're going to negotiate that upfront payment. We're going to make sure in every way possible that your fees and costs to work on this are going to be covered if you sign this agreement. It makes no sense that you get $100 and pay money for legal fees. And then they may not use it in the future. However, at the same time, you don't want to sign this and give up all of these rights and not have any additional terms added to this agreement. I'm going to jump off this a second and say, look, in this agreement, there's not a map. You don't even know in this form agreement, in their form agreement, you don't even know where this is going to be. It doesn't identify the location. That is crazy. You can't do this. Please don't do this, in my opinion. You really can't do it. And most of these things you can get taken care of if you know what you're doing. And then it becomes, what you don't get taken care of, you need to understand, well, what does that mean? What does it mean if I'm not able to address this term or if this stays in there? What do we expect and what might happen? I am Attorney Doug Clark. This is All Things Marcellus, here every Sunday from 8 to 9 a.m. talking about the Williams Forum Pipeline Right-of-Way Agreement, which is entitled Option to Purchase Pipeline Easement, and the Appalachian Midstream Pipeline Right-of-Way Agreement. Okay, I want to talk about, that was the Appalachian Midstream payment terms. How do they pay the second time? I want to hit the Williams one also before we hit break here. So, okay, Williams, again, paying that $100. So what they say, and this is, I'm going to jump around on their agreement, but it says, prior to the commencement of actual construction of the pipelines, remember, pipelines aren't just pipelines. They're all those rights that we talked about. So the word pipeline, you think about this metal tube. No, it could be above ground facilities, all of these other items, communication, electrical, all of these things under this defined term as pipeline. Okay, so prior to the commencement of actual construction of the pipelines, hereunder, the company may elect to exercise this option at the company's sole discretion by issuing the landowner an additional payment described in the separate letter agreement. So there's a separate document that sets forth payment. Jumping down some, it says, in the event the additional payment is not made to the landowner prior to the expiration of 5 years from the date hereof. So 5 years from the date you sign it, they have to decide. So if they don't pay you within 5 years, the option for this right-of-way and easement herein shall terminate, and the company shall have no further obligations to grantor. So what happens? They give you $100 under this agreement. Now, they give you $100. Again, you can negotiate that, and you better be negotiating that. They can give you $100, sit around for 5 years. 5 years. Never pay you or do anything. And then they can decide whether they want to do this or not. So they have 5 years to decide, and you're getting, under this agreement, $100. Going to get back here. I'm over. I'm going to talk more about this Appalachian Midstream Pipeline Agreement and the Forum Williams Pipeline Agreement. You're listening to All Things Marcellus with me, Attorney Doug Clark. Be right back after this break. Welcome back to All Things Marcellus with me, Attorney Doug Clark of the Clark Law Firm. Again, I think this is a very important show, and you need to check it out. A lot of information. I know sometimes it's tough, a lot to follow. Going through and have gone through some critical terms for the Williams Pipeline Right-of-Way Agreement that I've worked on probably maybe even a couple hundred, but well over 100. And we reach agreements on these. But this is the starting point, and these are the things that need to be changed. These are the things that need to be addressed. Same thing, Appalachian Midstream Services. You're in Bradford County. You're in Susquehanna County. You're in Wyoming County. You're getting these agreements. You need to be looking at these things. But it's the same thing with other companies. Started the show, say many times, I think it's about 50 companies that I've negotiated with. It's still the same process. What we're doing, though, is focusing on two of the most common agreements that are out there and pointing out these substantial problems. So I'm going to highlight a few more. Again, I always have these goals of what I want to get to, and I got all these red marks of items that I really want to point out that are bad, but time is limited. So I want to point out a few other things. I'm going to talk about, again, the Appalachian Midstream Contract, the AMS. A couple other things to point out. 65-foot permanent right-of-way. Remember that. The Williams is 75. But how much more? Where in the areas they want to work? Well, the AMS agreement says that during the times of construction, maintenance, repair, replacement, or removal, the landowner grants the company reasonable temporary off-easement use of the landowner's property while exercising these rights. So there's not even defined whatever's reasonable. Well, the company's definition of reasonable and yours may be very, very different. But even worse than that, and that's very bad, because you may think reasonable is 10 feet. They may think it's 75 feet. They may even think it's larger than that. Are you going to go into court and fight them on what's reasonable? Chances are, in almost all cases, no, you're not. So you have an undefined area. That can't happen. That can't happen. And I think you find good negotiating is going to get that area defined. You can't leave it this way. You can't. So it goes on. Again, worse than that, there's no area of a right-of-way here. There's no map. You need to have a map depicting and showing the location. Where is this going to be? Because right now you're just essentially saying, okay, here's my property. Do whatever you want. At the end of the day, though, it has to be 65 feet area. But you can have anything, essentially, anything above ground or below ground, necessary or convenient, pipelines of any kind, all kinds of things like we read at the beginning. But it's not even a defined location. So you need to have a map. Every agreement I think I've ever worked on, we've had a map defining the location. Where's this going to be? You have to do that. How can you not? You have to do it. Then, once you have a map, although you have a map, does that mean it could change from that area? And you need to be very careful about that, because the Williams agreements, it's very nice. They're typically going to provide you a map, and that's good. You need a map. Again, you need a map. But once you have the map, does that mean it has to go there? Can it change location? If it can change location, can a company change it anywhere they want? Do they need to have your approval? Do you have to be reasonable in withholding approval? In other words, if the company says, hey, and typically you're going to find this, when you get a map, it's going to say, well, we put it here, but we may have to change it. And we may get your consent, but you can't be unreasonable. Well, your definition of reasonable and their definition of reasonable may be very different, which means what? If you can't agree, you either have to let it happen or go to court or arbitration and fight it. You have to watch out for those issues. You need to eliminate as much uncertainty as possible. The biggest thing when landowners call me, and I wasn't involved before, and they call me and they say, well, I didn't think they could do that. They said that they never told me they would do that. I didn't know that could happen. And what does the company say? You signed the agreement. You signed the agreement. And they'll say after the fact, well, you should have taken it to an attorney. But when they hand it to you, they might even discourage you from going to an attorney. But later on, that's what they're going to point to. So if you have uncertainty, you need to know that you have uncertainty. And then you need to decide how comfortable are you with the fact that maybe this pipeline can change location. Maybe it's something that doesn't bother you. Most people it does, but maybe it doesn't you. Again, my theory and my belief is, look, I'm not here to be an obstructionist in any fashion. What I'm here to do for my clients and through the show is to educate people. My clients, we want to sit down. We want to make sure that in 2 years from now, you don't say, or 5 years, boy, that attorney didn't tell me that. Why didn't Doug tell me that? I want to tell you those things. We don't want you to be surprised. Again, I have hundreds of clients who have entered into these agreements, but we've done so after careful review, changing and altering the terms, discussing leverage and options. That's what you need to do. Here's another nugget on this Williams agreement. You sign this, you're being foolish. The Williams agreement in arbitration, it says at the end, okay, it's a long provision, but it says let me step back. If you have a dispute in the Williams agreement, it calls for arbitration, which may or may not be good. You got to discuss that with your attorney. You got to understand that. It's not just what you read online, I assure you. You need to get real life experiences. So, this says that you go through this arbitration process, any reasonable out-of-pocket costs incurred by the prevailing party to enforce any provision of this agreement as contemplated shall be reimbursed by the non-prevailing party within 30 days of receiving notice of these costs. So what does that mean? If you have a dispute with Williams and you go to arbitration and you lose and they're to the prevailing party, you have to pay their reasonable out-of-pocket costs. And those may include the arbitrator's costs. They may include expert fees, which would be reasonable. Their attorney fees, which may be hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of dollars an hour. Those are their costs. You can't do that. That is going to deter you from ever making even a reasonable challenge, because if you lose, it could cost you tens and maybe even more in trying to fight it. You can't agree to pay their cost in the event that you lose. Not because you're going to bring a frivolous claim, but because it may deter you or stop you from raising a legitimate claim because you're concerned that, boy, heaven forbid, if I lose, I have to pay their costs, which can easily be in the tens and tens of thousands. And I mean, it's conceivable in a major case, it could be 100,000 or more. That's going to deter you. It will chill you, as they say, from bringing a claim which may be very, very legitimate, but you're just afraid. Now, jumping back to the AMS agreement, like I said, there's no map there. It's $15. Lowest, please, guys, $15. Too low. There are times when you may sign at that, but those are very unique, and you need to understand why, and that's rare. Okay? And I can say, I don't care what, if this company says, well, this is what we pay everybody, forget that, because that doesn't make anything right. Just because they pay everybody a low price, or at least they say they do, doesn't mean that you should also get ripped off or receive a low price. Also, the AMS agreement, there's no indemnification language. Indemnification saying that if there's a problem, liability, if there's an accident, if there's lawsuits, are they going to defend you? There's no language in there saying that they are. So if somebody gets hurt, what are they going to do? They're going to sue the company, but they're also going to sue the landowner. And now you're going to have to pay for a defense. And boy, you probably, hopefully you didn't do anything wrong, but then you could be open to pay money to the person who was hurt or injured. You can't do that. Why they don't have an indemnification language in there, Most companies offer it. Give Williams some credit on this one. They offer, and it's pretty good language. You need to have it. All right, I'm already up against it. Go back, YouTube, All Things Marcellus, PA Gas Lease Attorney. Give me a call, 570-307-0702. Clark Law Firm, Doug Clark, please be thinking about these things. You're listening to All Things Marcellus. We'll see you next Sunday from 8 to 9 a.m. Have a great, great week, everyone.